Hey guys, so we're ready to start building out the UI for the chat for the listing. But before we do that, I want to add kind of a screen in the middle. So we right now have a list or a view where we can see all the listings, but I want to be able to click on a listing and just see it individually. And I want it to have like its own custom URL, so if I go to that URL, I see that listing. So that is what we are going to program today, and we're going to start off in the back end to create a query to be able to do this. So I'm going to go into the modules under the server and create a new under listing, a new folder called view. And view is basically going to be the same thing as find. So actually we can just take these two files, copy, paste them in view. The only difference is I'm going to call this view listing, and it's going to take a parameter called the ID, which is going to be a string, and it's going to return a single listing. Now notice here I'm not specifying whether it could be null or not, so in this case it can be null. And the reason I'm not putting exclamation mark is if they give us a bad ID and we can't find a listing, we're going to return null back. We can get rid of this listing type. We only need it in one place. Oops, got my caps lock on. And then in our resolvers over here, it's very easy to add this. We don't have to re-implement any of the picture URL or the owner stuff for our listing. We only need that in one place, which is really nice. So I can get rid of that. And here I'm going to call it view listing. And we're going to use one of our parameters here. So first one's the parent, we don't care about. The variables, we're going to get an ID. So now I'm going to say find. And for whatever reason, there's not a find by ID. We just have to use where, pass in an ID like that. So now I can use this query over here to grab a listing for an ID, and it should return me a listing back, or it should return null if it can't find one, or I guess undefined. Let's come over here and give it a try. So I'm going to say query view listing, and I'm going to refresh this. View listing, ID, and let's go ahead and grab one that exists. So let's grab this one. And now we can actually display any data we want. And now let me show you guys those off the screen for a second. Let's move this over here. Oh, I just did prettyify and it got rid of it. Okay, Control Z saved us. ID, I can get any of these things, price, name. I think most of it is just blank, but we can query it. Cannot return null for non-nullable field listing.id. Alright, let's see what's going on there. I'm going to just first prettify this though. So it's pretty simple what we're doing here. We're just returning a listing. So I'm not sure why it doesn't have an ID. So I'm going to say listing, and I'm going to await the response. And I'm just going to console log the listing so we can see what that's about. And then I'm going to return it. Give that a save. Because when I run this, we should either get undefined or we should get an object back, and that object should have an ID on it. Alright, we run that, and I'm going to open up my terminal. And oh, that's right. I'm expecting an array back, not a... So I guess I want to see if there's a way to just get one. I think there is. Yep, called find one. So what was happening is find returned an array, and what I really want to return is just a single guy. So I'm going to say find one instead. So now let the server restart. I'm able to just fetch that single listing, no problem now. And again, we can grab any attributes we want, just like the find listing that we care to render on the screen. So alright, let's now grab this and do some stuff on the UI with it. So I'm going to first add this to our controller. So we're going to create under modules. So we have find listings, create listings. Let's create a folder called view listing. And I'm going to copy the find listing and paste it in there. And I'm going to start by removing these guys. I'm going to say view listing query, and I'm going to call that query that, and give it uppercase, and then I'm going to say view listing, and I'm totally fine grabbing the same properties here. Grab more if you'd like to. Maybe on this page it makes sense to render the full thing, so maybe we also grab the category or whatever else you want to. And then there's one variable, so I'm going to add an ID, which is a string, ID. Now this thing should just return a single listing, and the listing could be null, but I'm going to go ahead and just keep this out for now. We need to really actually just build the types for this. So I have my controller up here. I'm going to say yarn gen types and just generate the types for that. And let's see what's got going on. Validation of GraphQL query broke. There can only be one operation, name that. Okay. I think it's because I haven't saved it. Okay, yeah. Let's rerun that. So if you guys didn't catch that, I just didn't save the file before I ran this again. So now it's good to go. And I can use the types. So I'm going to call this with view listing. And we get view listing, and that's right, we need to go and open up schema types. All right, and now I should be able to get an auto completion for it. And now I can hover over this and see if this is the right type, or I can control and click, and so this has all the information I expect back. Perfect. And that can sometimes be null, so I'm going to say or null. We can pass back loading, that's fine. Let's rename this here with view listing query. Now this does have some variables, so view listing, you'll notice there's a thing called variables, kind of similar to mutation variables. And then here I'm going to say with view listing. And I'm going to pass in this guy up here, view listing query. All right. So now listing here is equal to this type here. And by default, we're going to set it equal to null. And we're going to return listing. And now I'm going to say data dot view listing. And I'm going to say listing is equal to data dot view listing. Okay. So what we're doing is kind of similar to with the find. So I'm initially setting the listing to null. I'm checking if our data has come in yet or if it's still loading. If it's still loading, we just ignore it and we return null. Otherwise, we actually get the correct value from view listing. So if we hover over this, it may also be null here or undefined. So we only set it if we actually get a good value back, which is fine. Otherwise, we just return null. And that's what we return back. Now, there's one extra thing we have to add here. And that is that variable right here, which I call ID. So we need to pass that into this. So the way we can do this is through the option, and doesn't like that option. There we go. Options, and now this thing can be a function which takes the props and it returns an object, and this object can be any options you want to set. So here are just some of the options. If you open autocomplete, the thing we care about is variables, and we care about one variable called ID. So we expect so we can map our props. So in this case, I'm going to say props.listing ID. So whoever uses this component right here, we need them to pass a prop called listing ID. That way we can use that as our variable here. And this is how we know which listing to actually fetch. All right, so this looks good from the controller side. Let's go ahead and export this. and this is going to be view. Give that a save. Let's go ahead and build that. I'm going to say yarn build in the controller. So I'm assuming that built it correctly. If not, we'll take a look at it. But our next step is to now set up our front end, and we're going to start by creating a new route here. So the route I'm going to create is going to be called listing. And then I want to take a variable in the URL, and that's going to be the ID of the listing. So I can call that listing ID. Or I could call it ID, and this is the syntax you use with React Router to take a variable. So I don't expect someone to actually type this in the URL. Whatever they actually type after this, we're going to be storing in a variable called listing ID, which you'll see in a second. And then under listing, for web modules, we're going to create a folder called view, and I'm going to call this listing view, or I guess let's call it view listing connector. And this is going to be a TSX file, and we're just going to map it to this route over here. So import star as React from React, export class view listing connector. And now I actually want to use the higher order component, so extends from React.peerComponent. I've done that twice now. React.peerComponent. So I'm going to rename this to C. And we're going to use the render function. And now let's see if the build worked, because I want to wrap this in that higher order component we just created. Alright, so it built correctly. I might have to do a tslint, or I mean TypeScript server, TypeScript, just restart it so it sees the new types that we just added. And I'm going to say export const, so I'm not going to export the C up here, but I'm going to export this, and I'm going to say with view listing, and now here I'm going to wrap the component C, and it doesn't like it. In these cases, I just cast it to anything. I actually am not very good at getting the types correct with this. So whenever I have this where I have higher order components, I usually end up having to just cast it to anything, because it's really hard to get the TypeScript types working correctly with higher order components, especially if you have multiple going on. Alright, so now in our actual component here, we need to, actually the way I set this up, it's not going to work just the way we did it. So I'm expecting this guy to be passed a prop, right? We just talked about that. So we called that listing ID. And so right now, if I were to just pass this component directly to the route, so if I return null, we would have a problem. It would say it couldn't find the variable probably, or something like that. So let's just show you guys the error if we can. So we have our route set up. Let's see if everything passes in the build. Doesn't. I'm just going to restart this. So this is the web. I just restarted the server for that. And now how it's going to work is I go to something like /listings/ and then I can put whatever I want here. And so this is what's going to be stored in a variable. So if I go here, oh, and this should be /listing, not listings. And let's see if we get any error here. I'm not sure if we will or not. We get an object back. Oh, this is kind of interesting. I wonder if this is our subscription. I'm not sure why this is getting console logged. It's coming from test sub. So it looks like test sub is getting rendered even though it shouldn't. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that real quick because we don't really need that anymore. Go ahead and delete. And I'm going to remove it from the route here just so we don't clutter our logs. Alright, so a network request I think should come out. Oh, you know what? When you delete a file, sometimes it doesn't like it. So it says it can't find the name even though I already deleted it. Just kidding, I didn't delete it. Did I delete the wrong one? Let's do U. Yeah, I think I deleted the wrong thing. There we go. Oh, that's the problem, guys. I forgot to actually change it out here. View listing connector. Okay, so that was just my bad. I deleted it anyway, but I think that's okay. So we want to actually render the component we just created. So now we can see this in action. Our server may be still unhappy. Yeah, let's just Control C. Or it looks like, we'll say no. Looks like it's gonna oh, just kidding. I thought I was gonna be able to stop it from after I Control C'd it, but it didn't look like it wanted to. Alright, but when we go to this URL, what we should happen is it should complain about not getting a variable, because right now we're not passing a variable in. So let's see, so we got a bad request. So okay, whenever you get something like this where it's just bad request, this is a common thing that happens in Apollo sometimes. My recommendation and what I'm about to do is just head over to the network tab, and you actually can see a much better error message usually. So we can see the red over here, this is the thing that failed. And notice how we actually get a readable error message that makes sense. So it says variable ID of required string was not provided. So in this case, we didn't provide that variable that I was talking about. But notice that does not really show here at all. So keep in mind if you get that, that's how I recommend looking at that. So all right, so how are we going to pass in this ID, right, to actually give it to the variable? So there's a few ways to do this. In this case, we can create a component that basically wraps this and passes it in, and that's definitely an option. So what we could do is we could create a component here, and I don't know what I want to call it. Let's just call it view wrapper.tsx. I'm not really sure what to call it, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this, paste it, and then this really should just be a in this case, it would be a little bit simpler if we used a rendered prop, but this is good practice. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to say children. We're basically going to turn it into a rendered prop. So I'm going to say this dot props, dot children, and then I'm going to pass the parameter in here, this dot props, and we're going to be getting two things, I think. So I'm just going to destructure this so it's a little bit simpler. So children, loading, and then there's a third thing, listing. So here I'm going to render children. Actually, yeah, no, this is a fine way to do it, and we'll pass it in like this. So children, loading, listing. Now it doesn't like this because we need to add the TypeScript type to it. So I'm going to say with view listing. And then we also need to add that we're going to return these values in our children. So this is actually kind of working like a controller, if you will. So view wrapper, and I'm going to say props, and we're going to say children. It's going to be a function that returns a element or it returns null. So this first prop is called data, and it's going to pass loading, which is a boolean. And actually I can just copy with this with listing because that's exactly what we're going to return. And I'm just going to say props and, because we're going to do both. And all right, so we have the TypeScript types that are happy with this. So now all we need to do is we need to render this view wrapper and then pass it the ID that it needs. So over here, I no longer need this stuff. I'm going to say view listing connector, and I'm just going to render that thing we just created. View wrapper, and it's going to be a function like that. And now I'm going to just return null, or actually I kind of want to see what we get from this. So I'm going to return null and just console.log data, and data is going to be this. and I'm also going to export this still. And okay, it implicitly has a type of anything. I'm not sure why that has an implicit type of anything, because right here we explicitly said what the type of this should be. Why don't we just say any for now, and then if this does not give us the data we want, we might have to play with the types a little bit. I also could have messed up the type somewhere, but let's carry on with this. So now I need to pass that ID that we've been talking about. So I need to pass in a listing ID here, and this is what's going to which listing we want to fetch for. And the listing we want to fetch for is whatever is in the URL here. So to be able to get that in our route, because this is a route, if we look at what we're actually rendering, we're rendering view listing connector. So this guy is a route, so that means he has route props. So route component props, and let's import this from the right place. So this is coming from React Router DOM. And then here we need to actually, so we've always just did an empty object here, but whenever you have stuff in the URL, any variables, this is where you actually fill out the object. So in this case, we have something called listing ID. So the name here matches the name that we used right here. So listing ID here, and this is going to be a string. All right, so now I can access this through the props. So this dot props, so match, and then we can destructure match, and then there's a thing called params, and in there there's something called listing ID, and so we can just pass that listing ID right here. And now I'm thinking we should get some data. Let's go ahead and see if we get anything console logged here. Both cases the listing is null, so there's either two cases here. One, our server request is messed up, or two, something in the controller's messed up. So the way I'm going to figure out which it is I'm going to head over to the network tab, and I'm going to look at the request. And here it's just invalid syntax for the type. Oh, in this case we really should just get null back because I didn't click the right one. So now I'd like to put a valid one in here. So I'm going to copy this ID here. We probably, it would be ideal to add some kind of error handling for that probably. So in this case, there might not be anything wrong. Let's run it with that. And now we actually get some data for that listing. So I actually can see this user's data and stuff. So nice. So I can render that if I want to. But before I do, I don't really expect a user to actually paste in a listing ID over here. Really what I want is to head over to the listings and to be able to click on this and to be sent over there. So let's add that real quick because it's really easy. So that's going to be in our find connector. Now you can pretty much make any of this clickable. I don't know if you can make any of this stuff a link. I'm not really sure how because I haven't used a card like this before. I'm thinking I can just use the link component from React Router DOM. We'll see if this works though. So let's go ahead and import it. Oh, none of them are coming from the right place. That's okay though. So React Router DOM. And then here you specify the route you want it to go to. So in this case, we want to go to listing / and then the ID of that listing, which is l.id. All right, so let's see if it lets us click that now. And it does, and now it takes me to the ID. Now what I want to do is actually just render that onto the screen so we can see something. So let me close these because I have a lot of tabs open. So that's a wrapper. Here we're going to say div, and I'm just going to say if data.listing. So if it doesn't exist, I'm just going to return, in this case you could return a loading screen, so I'm going to say ... loading. Otherwise, if we do have data down here, I want to say data.listing.name, Or you know what, I could do the ID, you can do whatever you want here. And you can make something more styled. Alright, so now we can see I am a house, which I think, yep, that's what I named it. And if I come here to I am an apartment, you can see I am apartment. And so now I can click on either of those and go to their individual pages, and I can actually just see the data for the individual ones and go back and forth, and I can refresh and it saves it because it knows which one to fetch from the URL. Now I'm curious why this didn't work. I want to kind of just delete that there. I'm really curious why we didn't get type definitions right here, because in my view wrapper I specified it right here. I'm curious if, yeah, this is just an interface. So I'm not sure where I messed up with the type definition here. I want to kind of play around with that and see if I can figure it out. If any of you guys know how to get that definition working, let me know, because we're basically doing the same thing with our controller other places, so I might just have to fiddle with it. Do let me know if you know what's going on. I'll try to figure it out as well. But that's it for this video, guys. Thanks for watching. I hope that was helpful with figuring out how to fetch a single item and pass props. And also, I know there's probably a better way to do this. We probably could have just skipped one of these components, and probably instead of making this guy right here a higher order component, it probably would have been easier to just make him into a rendered prop in the first place. But this gives you a little extra practice how you can kind of make your own rendered prop, and some advanced React stuff right there for you.